Great. So just to clarify what we're all here for, this peer review panel is basically just to have a few experts who have a lot of experience and have been even won awards for their reviewing, to basically just ask them questions and get their perspectives on the peer review process. Peer review is an important part of the scientific publishing process, but doesn't normally come with formal training. So good review practices are essential to a fair process that results in helpful feedback for the authors. So here in this webinar, these panelists, including outstanding reviewers and current editors from EGU journals, will answer your questions about the peer review process and discuss best practices when reviewing scientific papers. So I'll go ahead and let our panelists introduce themselves. We'll go ahead and start with Xiaojing.
Hi, everyone. I'm Xiaojing Du. I'm currently an assistant professor from George Mason University. I just started my new position this January. You can tell that from the bookshelf behind me. It's almost empty. Yeah. So I'm a climate scientist and also paleoclimatologist. My work focusing on the hydroclimate change from the last glacial maximum, which is about like 21,000 years ago to present. And I'm particularly interested in how hydroclimate change in response to both internal climate variability like ENSO, Pacific Decadal Oscillation, and also external forcing like sea level change, greenhouse gas concentration change, change in orbital forcing. Yeah, and I'm using both geochemical proxy records to reconstruct climate change in the past and also using numerical modeling to investigate the underlying mechanisms. Yeah, thanks for having me today. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. Jay, do you want to go next?
Hi, yes, my name is Zhe Feng, and I'm a atmospheric scientist at the Pacific Northwest National Lab. Been working here over 10 years now, and I'm currently associate editor for JGR Atmosphere. My background is mostly on studying deep convection, organized convection, and their roles in the climate system and how they could change in the future. Yeah, I'm so happy to be here. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And finally, Nick.
Hi, everyone. It looks like we have a nice crowd. I am a senior program manager at the American Geophysical Union. I oversee peer review of 8 or 9 journals, as well as our preprint server, ESS Open Archive.
Perfect, thanks. So as you can see, we've got some great panelists here who will have a lot of great information for you guys. We strongly encourage anyone who has any questions to put them in the chat. And if we think they're good questions that everyone can benefit from hearing answers to, then we'll go ahead and ask them. We do have a few pre-prepared questions. So since we haven't had time for anyone to ask questions yet, obviously, we'll go ahead and start with some of these. So our first question just kind of focuses more generally on the process. What is your typical process for reviewing a paper, and how long do you spend reviewing it? So Jay or Xiaojing, if either of you want to start, please feel free.
Yeah, maybe I can start. Yeah, well, I'm still early career, so I'm also in the process of learning how to be a efficient and good reviewer. I typically spend like 8 to 10 hours reviewing one paper, which I think is probably relatively longer compared to like more senior scientists maybe. Yeah, and I usually read the paper from the very beginning to the very end for once, and sleep on it, let it sit in my mind for a while, so that I can get the general idea of this paper. For example, the motivation of this research, what is the main scientific questions the author would like to answer in this work, the methods, and also the main conclusions, and more importantly, the main strengths and weakness of this work. And after that, I will read the paper for another time with more details and pay more attention to maybe the results and discussion sections, so that I can provide more details in my comments about the weakness and strengths of this work, whether there's any like actual analysis needed, which can help support the conclusion of this work, and also with more details about the, for example, the data visualization. I will go over the figures of this manuscript to see whether I can provide some suggestions on the visualization part. And also I will take notes in the second round of the reading so that I can provide more details on my comments. And yeah, I think after the second reading, I will be able to I think probably get the main body of my comments. And after that, I will review my comments to see whether my comments is clear enough and whether there is something else I will need to add. Yeah, that's a basic process.
Jay, do you want to say something, or I can just add a couple tips in here? Before you begin reading the paper, I'd suggest opening up the reviewer input screen and see what kind of questions you'll be asked when you actually do submit your review. We have quite a few good suggested things to look for in there, including the data statement and whether the key points are complete and the conclusions reflect the rest of the paper, etc. You also should take a look at whether the paper was reviewed before. We'll include a response to reviewers, to their previous reviewers, as well as a track changes file, and that can save you a lot of time if the paper's already undergone refereeing.
Right, maybe I can chime in a bit. I'm so glad to hear Xiaojing is such a dedicated reviewer that I, as an associate editor, I would love to get reviewers like these who would provide really detailed comments, organized. But for me, if nowadays when I'm reviewing paper, particularly if it's sort of in my area of expertise, I don't think I need to spend that much time on it anymore, maybe on average about 4 hours or so. I typically like to skim through paper. Like I'm reading a published paper, I will skim through the abstract, perhaps skim through some of the conclusions to see what's the major things that this paper addresses. And I'll actually scan through some of the figures to go through, see if the storylines kind of make sense, the visualizations, like I can basically understand the key things that discuss in the paper without actually reading into the details. If they are, then I would have a pretty good idea, oh, this is a pretty good quality paper. If you look at the figures and you have no idea what it's talking about, then that review process will obviously be probably a bit longer. So preparing nice figures, understandable ones are one of the most important things, I think, in a paper. Obviously, you have to set up some storylines, like what is the major gaps in understanding or advancements that the paper is making. But good visualizations is key, essential, in my opinion. But then I would go through, obviously go through just like what Xiaojing said, go through it in sequence, and then looking at whether I understand the key methodologies and whether the analysis makes sense, things like that. And then when I write up my review, I tend to like having sort of an overview of what's the key, similar to Xiaojing said, the key strengths and weaknesses of the paper, and then go through some of the major comments. Like these are the more critical things I feel like the paper could be improved. And then the later ones are more minor, like grammars or some missing references or things like that. So sort of organize it that way so that as an associate editor, when you look at those reviewer comments, I also look through it like that way. First of all, I looked at, okay, whether there's some major issues with this at the high level, and then looking at some of the major comments. The minor ones, I usually don't scan it that much because then I will let the authors address those. But like if you can write your reviews in this way, it really helps the associate editor to categorize them. Oh, you know, we look at 3 reviewers, they both mostly have similar, this kind of high level reviews or suggestions, then it makes the associate editor's job a lot easier. Right? Okay, the reviewers basically agree that this should be either like a major revision or minor revision or more problematic ones. Yeah, so that's some of my opinions on this. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, I think that all sounds like really good info. So we've got a number of questions from the chat, which is great. We're going to try to distill these into more generalized, simpler questions, I think. But keep them coming. So we'll go ahead and start with one. As you have developed as a reviewer, are there certain areas or components of a paper you focus on more? I think one of the examples used was statistics specifically. So do you guys have any comments on that? Judging, do you want to begin again?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I think so when I make a decision for a paper, I think the first thing is whether the main conclusion can be supported by the evidence provided by this work. And of course, statistical analysis is an important aspect of this. So yes, I will pay attention to that. And also I know, like, for example, in the field of paleoclimatology, there are people working on proxy records, geochemical analysis, geological records, and also there are people working on modeling. I basically do both of them, so I will pay attention to both aspects. And especially if there are data model comparison, like compare the proxy records with modeling simulation, I will pay more attention to the bridge between them. Yeah, I think based on the background and expertise of the reviewers, definitely we will have different emphasis or different things we want to focus on. And also, I think as the editor, when they invite the potential reviewers, they will also keep that in mind, so that reviewers can provide opinions and suggestions from different perspectives. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I agree. It really depends on the expertise of the reviewer, right? If you have more experience in, say, modeling, you probably pay more attention to the details of the methodology of the models setup and configuration and things like that. But if you are more of an observationalist, you might pay more attention to uncertainty in the observations, how you use that, whether you interpret it properly. And so it's just depends on your backgrounds and your experience, and that's fine. And that's kind of the job for the associate editor, like Xiaojing said, that to find reviewers, balanced reviewers to have different aspects. Ideally, you don't necessarily always get that because people are busy, and if the ideal reviewers you look for, they turn it down, then you just kind of have to go with the other options where reviewers are available. So, but we try our best to do that.
Great, thanks. I've got another question from the chat. How do you decide to recommend a paper for accept with minor revisions, accept with major revisions, or revise and resubmit? How do you determine basically which category it goes into? Jody, you want to start?
Well, so when I'm serving as associate editor, what makes my job easier is if all three reviewers give a similar kind of recommendation, right? If they all say major revisions, then I look through some of the high-level comments to see why they say this is the case. And if I feel like, oh, I think they somewhat have an agreement on these aspects need to be addressed before accepting, then that's pretty easy. And I would say maybe like half or more of the papers that I handle are typically in this category in the first round of revision. It's pretty common to have major revisions, even though sometimes I could see that the reviewers say, oh, these are I recommend minor revision, but when you actually look at their comments, it's like a long list of things that they need to address. Then I would just pick a major revision because I feel like there's substantial works that the authors need to do, even though the reviewer might say, oh, these are minor. So that's one category. The other one that say reject but encourage resubmit, that would be typically when I looked at the comments, they have substantial issues with the paper that probably would take longer than a typical review cycle, like 1 or 2 months, that the authors can complete. For example, they say, oh, there's major issues with the analysis methodology or the simulations that we need to rerun or run more. Those would take longer. And then in those situations, I would recommend reject now, but encourage resubmit. It's kind of rare to have a paper, at least the ones that I've handled, that have just outright reject because the quality is so bad that you can't, there's no way you can publish this in the current state. It's kind of rare. So most of the time, the papers that I've handled are in this like either major or just it gives the authors more time to revise the paper so you can resubmit at a later date without the constraint of the time. Yeah, so that's my experience on it.
Maybe I can add a little bit on that. Yeah, so from my experience, like I totally agree with what Feng said. Like, well, if the work has potential to be published, but it needs more analysis or like more simulation results and or more chemical analysis, which will take longer, like six months, 3 months, which is longer than the typical review cycle. If that is the case, maybe I will reject at this stage, but encourage submission. I will say that in my comments. Yeah. Yeah, and if the quality is below the bar of the journal, and rewritten is needed, if that is the case, I probably will reject the paper. Yeah, so and I think maybe different journal also have different requirement. Like some journal may pay more attention to the innovation of the work, like even though the work itself is solid, but it's not innovative enough. Maybe it's not a good targeted journal for this work. Yeah, and for most journals, I think if the work itself is valuable, it's a useful contribution to the community, and the work itself is solid, the conclusions can be supported by the evidence, and there are always room to make improvement, of course, but if that is case, maybe like major revision or minor revision is enough. Yeah.
I think it's also important when you're making a distinction between minor and major revision to consider the deadlines that these journals put on the revisions. At AGU, our journals for minor revisions generally give about 10 to 14 days, 2 weeks. And then for major revisions, the authors are allowed 4 weeks on average, with some wiggle room of about 2 weeks for extensions, if that helps make this decision.
Great, thanks. So we're getting a lot of questions from the chat, which is great. So we'll take another one from there. How do reviewers and editors prefer data sets or coding scripts or more technical aspects to be cited in a paper? Are there guidelines for AGU journals to point authors to? So Nick, I think you can definitely have some insight on that second point at least.
Yeah, we have a data for authors page. I'll paste it as a reply in the chat. Our administrative staff do enforce some pretty stringent data requirements about open research in the open research statement of the paper. The primary data or the software used or the scripts, etc., need to be cited in the bibliography and also cited in the text in that open research statement. And in the bibliography, they need a tag in square brackets that describes what they are, and that helps us mark it up on the published version so that the resource is indexed and it gives people credit where it's due, etc.
Yeah, I also started to pay more attention to now, particularly data sets like citing the DOIs. It's the most important one. Where it used to be just you mention where you get the data, like in the data availability section, like just a link. But I don't think that's enough anymore. I think AGU requires now to have the DOI for the specific data set that you cited listed in the reference, just like the other publications that you cited, that they are required. And I think that's the way to go, to be giving credit to the people producing the data set or software in other cases that also can have DOIs. Although that's still, I think it's an evolving field. I mean, myself have produce softwares or open source codes that generating DOIs is still a little bit tricky. But there are ways to do that. And it's preferred to have a DOI. Then it's very specific pointing to that thing.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add on. Like based on my own publication experience on AGO journal last year and this year, I can see there's difference. Like there are more requirements for the open access of data and also the code, which I think is good for other, like for colleagues in the same field, for readers, and also for the owner of the data, so that they can be given credits for generate the data and the codes. Yeah, it's a good thing. Yeah.
I think there's a continuous challenge in terms of like making everything sort of open access, primarily because at least in the atmospheric science field, that many of the data sets generated, particularly model simulations, are very, very large, the raw data at least. There's no way you can just put it somewhere that are free to host the data that everyone can access. But in that case, what I typically do and recommend others would do is for the finalized like process data that you at least you use to generate the figures and the final results, share them as much as possible. Zenodo is a good way, a good website to do that. They allow up to 50 gigabytes of data, which typically it's pretty sufficient if you're just, the finalized data set that you use to make the figure and some of the codes that you did, you just zip them all into a file and upload to Zenodo and then provide some basic information on what this is for this particular journal. And then you get a citable DOI and then just point to that. And that will be at least how I handle it. The raw data is too big, then you have to store it in some place and just say that, well, if you're really interested in that, you have to, contact the authors to get those. I don't see an easy way to handle these moving forward, because we just have too much data volume to handle. I don't know if Nick has some other thoughts on making things as open access as possible.
Yeah, we do have some tips on the author resources, the data resources that I linked, about storing very large data sets. And like you say, sometimes we'll just ask for a representative sample. We're interested in giving credit, but we're also interested in reproducibility. So it comes down to discretion, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Those are some good resources and good insight. I have another question from the chat. What is a reviewer's responsibility to check the honest and accurate reporting of the data and the analysis? Joe, do you want to start with this one?
Can you say that again? The reviewer's responsibility?
Sure. Yeah. So what is a reviewer's responsibility to check the honest and accurate reporting of data and analysis? Basically making sure they're not fudging numbers or anything like that. Yeah, this is a difficult question.
Yeah, I mean, that's challenging, right? Your time is limited. typically what I do is just checking the link that they provided, or DOIs in that case, in the case they do provide them, to make sure that they are accessible. I don't really have time to go check the data whether they are valid or not. That's really the responsibility or ethical issues with the authors themselves, right? I trust that you are doing your due diligence and not faking up whatever data that you have. I think it's very difficult for as a reviewer to check that, unless you really question some of the things that the analysis or the results that this particular analysis or the paper presenting, and they actually provide access to the data or even the codes, then you can really go in and check. But unless that's like, you're like, wait, that doesn't really make sense, then I don't really go check that carefully.
Yeah, I agree with this. Yeah, so it's kind of challenging for a reviewer to really dig up the raw data to check whether the data used in this work is solid or not. But at least, for example, the data used in this paper should be, if it's published previously. So I think that is a sign that the paper, the data is reliable. And also, some cases, like I'm familiar with the data set the authors are using, because I'm also using this data set. In that case, I will have a better idea about whether the data is reliable, what is the uncertainties of it. And also, I think there are some cases like in the data analysis, like the authors provide the whole data set. But in the results and discussion part, they may focus on a sweet point, like they didn't actually discuss the whole data set. So I think that is a problem, an issue. And also sometimes, like when I have a look at the figure, the results, I'm not convinced by the results. And in that case, I will ask where the data comes from, whether it is reliable in my comments. Yeah.
AGU has been devoting some resources towards the Notebooks Now program and creating notebooks, which are a way to consolidate the data input with the software that processes it, so that anyone can do their computing in the cloud and come to the same results as the authors. So that's something that we're working towards, and it's kind of a hot topic right now.
Can you elaborate on what you mean by notebooks?
Yeah, so a notebook is a product that binds together, I guess, consolidates the information, the data, and allows the person using it to perform the computing in the cloud. So you can run their Python program without actually downloading it and come to the same outputs with the same process data as the authors. You can, I guess, perform the same process experiment. Yeah.
Well, that works if the code is in Python, but if there are many other languages that people use,
For an example, right? Yeah, in R
Right.
or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That's cool. I didn't know that.
Got another question from the chat. That was actually also one of our prepared ones, so we'll kind of combine this. So who is typically qualified to review a paper? Are students able to conduct reviews? And if so, can they receive any help from their advisor, especially if this is their first paper they're reviewing? Do you need to have papers published to be considered? Is there any kind of system set up to credit co-reviewers, like when an advisor asks a student to help? So I know this is multiple parts, so if you need me to repeat them, please let me know.
Right. I do look for early career or students, including students, to do reviews. I think it's good practice for them, and I also think that they probably have more time than more senior people, like including their advisors. So what I started doing now is, when I see papers published in the fields that I'm familiar with, and they are. It's sometimes it's kind of easy to tell because the first author is not the corresponding author. then you can see, oh, that's probably a student that his advisor from university or some organizations that are that working together. You can also check their if they are the same from the same organization, and then I would try to find the student, although sometimes it can be hard. Like I would say, oh, this institution, they have this person's name. If they don't list their email in the paper that they publish, it's a little bit harder. But I would try my best to give early career people and students, including students, the opportunity to review papers. But I typically look for, in terms of qualification, that they have published papers in similar topics before doing that, because otherwise I wouldn't know whether the student is qualified to review that, right? So that would be my approach. I don't remember the other parts of the questions now.
Yeah.
code
So
review.
there's, yeah.
I don't think I've done that before. How does that actually work?
I think I actually did the first paper I reviewed. I basically just had my advisor look over it and make sure that my review passed her test, basically. And so she semi-reviewed the paper as well, but not really. But I still put her down as a co-reviewer. So that's my experience with it. I think that's generally what people are asking. I know we have a lot of students in the chat who may or may not have reviewed before. So just kind of how that process would work if you are still a grad student and you're doing your first or second.
So would
That
that
would
be
go.
reflected in the written review part where you say this review is co-reviewed by, or is it in the system that, like, how do you know?
Yeah, I think that's one of the questions is there a system set up? So that might be a good question for Nick.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can answer a couple in the chat that are related. At AGU, we do have co-reviews. You can, when you submit your review to any of our journals, you can specify one other individual. You might be able to do one more, but at least one individual who worked on the paper with you. And that person will also get credit. They can register the review with their ORCID, just as they would if they were a real reviewer. And they're also recognized at the end of, or the beginning of the year when we publicly recognize reviewers.
Yeah, maybe I can add on a little bit on that. So for me, like actually my first review experience is together with my advisor, my PhD advisor. She got the review invitation and the paper is closely relevant to my research topic. And she invited me to review the paper together with her. And probably at that point, there's no co-reviewing option in the system, but she mentioned me in the comments, so I also got the credit. So that is my first official review experience. And I think have publication experience is helpful for being a reviewer. First of all, like you experience the process, the peer review process. You get the feedback from the reviewers, and you know what the reviewer number 2 looks like, what the good reviewer or bad reviewer looks like. So you have a better idea about the what constructive comments looks like. So that is helpful. And also, I think, as Joe mentioned, if you have publication on the similar topics, editor will recognize you. They will see you and they will invite you to be a reviewer. So that's why I think the publication experience is helpful. But I'm not sure whether that is necessary. Like for PhD students, maybe they haven't got their first author paper published yet, but they have enough research experience to serve as a reviewer. Maybe not official reviewer experience, but for me, like when I taking class as a PhD graduate student, we have like the project or the term paper, like review a paper and read comments for it. So that is also kind of practice for it. So even though not be invited by the editor as a reviewer officially, but maybe students also have some experience as a reviewer. Yeah, so I think that is also helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes I would do this too when I look for reviewers. I know that certain, say, professors that they work in this field, they likely have students. So I sometimes will put in a note for the editor assistants to, when they contact the professor at some universities, like if you're too busy, but if you have students who have worked in this field that you can recommend them review, that would be great, because I don't know all your current students. So, but you probably do, and so that would be really helpful if the faculties and the professors, they have students that have relevant experience in the topic of the paper, the manuscript, and they give the opportunities for the students to review. I think those would be great. And having a mechanism from the journal to recognize this effort, it's even better. Like to give credit for the students who review the paper.
Yeah, no, sounds great. I know that was a multi-part long question, but it seems like we hit every point, so that's great. We've got another one from the chat. It's also similar to a pre-prepared one. How much should reviewers focus on the grammar and the language of a paper? Is there a separate step from this kind of peer review where someone specifically goes through and checks papers for grammatical errors?
Yeah, after a paper is accepted in the journal, we have a typesetter who will proofread it and mark changes that they think should be made. So that's done after acceptance. Typically, a reviewer won't see a paper if the paper is unintelligible or the English grammar or syntax is very bad. It won't get past the editor, and they'll suggest major revisions or reject the paper so it can be cleaned up. It's not something the reviewers are necessarily expected to do.
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes would pick up some of them, but if there's so many of them, then I would just say, no, this paper needs more work before actually getting reviewed. But you know, occasional typos and things like that happens, especially if English is not your native language. So that I can understand. And to the extent I can, if I catch some of them, I would point it out, either put it in the dedicated sort of grammar section if there's multiple of them, or I can just simply mention it in a minor comments like, oh, you know, I catch some of these typos or grammar issues. If just only a few of them. If there's like substantial amount, then I would just say reject. You have to clean this up before a more proper review. But that's kind of rare now.
Yeah, I agree. I think most paper I got are well written, and also I pay more attention to the structure of the paper, like whether the the organization of the paper is logical, and also whether the expression and the sentence are clear and accurate, whether is there potential confusion, things like that. And I will, if there are grammar errors, I will point that out in the minor comments.
Thanks. We have another question from the chat. When authors cite methodology from a previously published paper, do you go back and review the original method?
Typically no, but I typically would hope the authors to provide enough sort of high-level summaries on how the methodology works without the necessary reader's perspective to say, oh wait, I don't understand how this works. I actually go back to read the paper that it refers to. That's not good enough. I think it needs to provide sufficient sort of high-level descriptions without all the details, because then it will be like way too long if the methodology is mostly similar to what's published before. But you need to provide enough description to at least for someone, for example, have some backgrounds in this particular topic, to understand, oh, okay, this is what you did. You don't have to repeat all the details, but you have to have enough to understand what you did. You can't just say, oh, we follow this method and that's it. Like, no, that's not sufficient. At least a few sentences explain like what that method is doing. At least that's how my take of it. It's a little bit harder if for a reviewer, if that's not your area of expertise, then maybe you would ask for even more information, like you need to describe the methodology. But yeah, so then it's up to the different reviewers to say achieve a balance for previous methodologies.
Yeah, I basically agree. And well, if it's a key evidence, I probably will follow, like go back to the original publication. For example, in the field of paleoclimatology, the chronology, the age model, is important. So sometimes the authors will set the previous publication said, well, the age model is from this paper, and then we'll go back to have a look at whether the age model is good enough for the purpose of this research. And also the same for published model simulation outputs, whether the model is outputs is sufficient to support the conclusion of this work. Yeah, so in those cases, I will go back to have a look at original publication. And also, I totally agree that even though the methodology has been already published previously, the author should give a brief description of it, not just to say like follow someone else the method. Yeah, and I did experience some paper like they summarize the previous methods not accurately. That is a red flag, definitely. Yeah.
Right.
Awesome. So we just got another one from the chat. What are some of the most common issues you see with papers during the first round of submission?
It's kind of hard to think about what's common, and because every paper is different. Common issues.
I think another way to phrase this is there anything that immediately typically will jump out to you is like, you know, like certain issues that you always end up focusing on and see more often than some other minor things. I'm not sure. We have a few different ways that this same kind of question was asked.
Mm. Yeah, I really can't think of. It's usually pretty specific to particular papers. I've seen all kinds of different issues before. I don't know if I can think of like a more common issue. More common ones I would think perhaps are the first round. Again, focusing on the figures that many manuscripts don't quite pay enough attention to the quality of the figures. Like not quite polished enough. When you see like, oh, we just kind of quickly put this together. It's not quite labeled enough, that it's hard to find like what is this showing. It's hard to interpret without looking at the caption. Even looking at the caption, I still don't understand what it's showing. I have to look at the text. Those are the pretty common issues that would typically result in major revision, because if you look at the figure for a while and then you have no idea what is it talking about, and you are actually, you know, have experience in this field, that's not a good figure. You need to go back and revise it. But yeah, I often want to stress that it's really important to have a high quality figure that hopefully would describe itself without needing too much extra information. I strive to put enough information on the figure that you don't even need to read the caption too much unless there's really too much detail. You have to know some of that. Like you just, okay, look at figure. I know what this is showing roughly. That's a good figure.
Yeah, I think what I take away from Jill's comments, maybe if the paper is not well written, like it's the data visualization, the figures are poorly done, and also maybe the structure and organization of the paper is hard to follow. I think that is a not well written paper, which is the quality of the paper itself is probably not be able to meet up the requirement of the journal for publication. And also in terms of the content of the paper or the research itself, I probably will pay attention to whether the data set or whether the model simulation, the design of the model, the data is sufficient to support the conclusion of this paper. Maybe like the resolution of the data is not high enough, or the design of the model, there's a problem which cannot be used to support the conclusion of the paper. And also, like, if model simulation is used to investigate the mechanism from the observation, if there's a mismatch between the model results and the observation, so it's unreasonable to use the model to help explain the observation data. Yeah, something like that. I think it's a red flag for research. Yeah.
Great. So we've got another question from the chat. If you make suggestions or if you have a problem with the initial manuscript, and then in the second round of reviewing, the authors have not addressed it at all or not thoroughly addressed it enough, how do you typically handle that?
Yeah, so what you're saying is, if I say the first round, I said major revision, I pointed out these issues, and then the revision, it didn't really address those.
Exactly.
That's kind of rare, but I would give another opportunity, another major revision, and pointed out that the authors did not address my comments clearly and stated why. I asked for these things, your response or whatever revision you have didn't address those. I would point it out clearly and give the authors another opportunity. Perhaps sometimes they misunderstood my comments in the first round, and then that happens. So give them another opportunity, and hopefully they would take it more seriously that time. If they don't, well, the third round, I would just say reject, because you just, you're not respecting the reviewer's comments, particularly if I have strong reason to support why you should do this, why you need to address these comments. Otherwise, there'll be substantial implications on how the papers, the results are. Then I think those comments need to be taken more seriously. But I usually would give the authors another chance, just because sometimes written comments may not be understood properly by the authors.
Yeah, I think in most cases, the authors will carefully address all the comments, and there are some rare cases, like if they have a really strong argument, like why that is not necessary, and I'm convinced, and then it's fine. Or I probably will give another major revision and also explain and emphasize why I think that analysis or actual measurements are important and critical for the quality of this work.
Yeah.
That's great. Good insights there. So I think we have time for a couple more questions. looks like, at least as far as I can tell, we've made it through most of the chat questions. So how often do you guys, how often do you review papers? Do you agree to review every submission you're asked to? What's a normal timeline look? And I know for both of you, these will be different. So if we want to start with Xiaojing on this one, maybe.
Yeah, for me, like I probably got invitation every 1 to 2 months. Once every 1 to 2 months, so maybe like 2 to 3 review invitation every semester. Yeah, so I basically say I say yes to most invitations. And I think that is like I would like to contribute the time to help my community to like get like provide my suggestions to help improve others' work. I think that is a rewarding process. And also maybe it's because I'm early career. I also think, well, that means my work is recognized by the editor. So I think it's an honor for me to review papers. But also I start to realize that sometimes my schedule is busy, and that makes me feel bad if I can't provide my feedback very timely. So I'm also thinking maybe I should say no a little bit more. And I heard a philosophy. I think it's pretty fair that every time I publish the paper as a corresponding author, then I will accept 2 to 3 reviewer invitation, because for each publication that needs maybe 3 reviewers. Yeah. So I think I probably will follow that philosophy in the future. Yeah.
Good for you. I wish I could do that. I get way too many requests to reviews. I can't take every single one of them for sure. I don't know. I get on average maybe like 3 to 4 a month. But I've known a lot of colleagues who have experience in different kind of things, and I typically would ask them if they're interested, particularly some of the topics that are very relevant to what they're currently doing that I know. I would ask them, oh, I think this paper could be of interest to you, and I will ask them nicely. And if it's particularly for the more early career people that are still sort of developing their skill set in certain fields, and they would be interested in reviewing those, and I would delegate the reviewer task to them. But I would take the ones that I would say have more experience on, and I feel like has potential to be making something new based on what they describe in the abstract, then I would usually take those as well. But again, I'm also working as associate editor, so it's like I've seen enough of those that I can't possibly take all the review requests from so many different journals now. So it's kind of balance, right? But I agree that if you can do the 2 to 3 reviews per papers that you publish as a lead author, that would be a good metrics to follow.
Of all of
Yeah.
our journals, the median reviewer does 2 reviews. And I think the outlier is in radio science, we had someone who did 25 reviews, but usually around 2 reviews per reviewer a year.
Got it. Those are good rules of thumb. So I think we have time for 1, maybe 2, if this is quick questions. This one, I know there is a process for declaring these. So Nick, you might be able to answer. How do you determine and handle any potential conflicts of interest that may arise?
Okay, I can go first, sure. So you've got to use your best judgment, I suppose. Generally, people will excuse themselves from reviewing a paper if they've worked with one of the authors in the past. And there's variations on how long ago that was. But if you feel that you can offer an unbiased review, check with the editor and let them know. We have an ethics professional on staff that can help you decide as well if you're still uncertain.
I also have actually similar questions. In as associate editor, when I find reviewers, the system sometimes when you search a reviewer, they would list it as potential conflicts, like yellow color, and not quite clear to me, like what exactly does that mean? Is that up to the reviewers, the discretion to decide whether they actually have conflicts, or the red ones, I know that you should also choose that reviewer, but the potential ones, it's not clear to me, like how does the system determine that? Nick, do you know?
Yeah, yes, I was looking at another window. So in the AGU system, if someone is at the same institution as one of the reviewers, it will be flagged red.
Sure.
Rather yellow, I'm sorry, yellow. If someone is on the paper, if someone is a co-author on the paper, it'll be flagged red. And there are lots of different ways to spell the same institution's name. If it's NIH, if it's the National Institutes of Health, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there are a million scientific foundations across all the countries of the world. So it's not a perfect match, but that's what the colors mean.
Okay. Just the institutions for one of the co-authors. All the co-authors institution would get checked. Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Oh. Okay.
Against the potential reviewers.
Okay.
So that's good to know. So we've got just a few more minutes before we wrap up. We've got one last question. Is there any just like very brief last minute advice, just one little nugget of wisdom that you would want someone to take from this who's just beginning their journey as a peer reviewer? So Joe, if you want to begin this one.
It's a useful experience because you get to know what the reviewers look for, right? And then when you write your paper, you hopefully would gain that experience to guide you, like what constitutes a good paper. How does another person or reviewer would see this and anticipate potentially some of the questions, and hopefully you could improve the quality of your manuscript in that way. Particularly, it's an experience that the early career researchers should try to do as much as possible. Yeah, so that would be my advice.
And Xiaojing, if you want to add anything else to it, be great.
Yeah, I totally agree that I will encourage early career graduate students, postdoc to take the reviewing experience as opportunity to learn about the peer review process and what the reviewer are looking for when they review a paper, and that will be good for early career for them to make more publication. Yeah, and also there are some training opportunities or resources. I think AGU have like webinar like this or other types of resources useful for early career. Yeah, I think it's good to take advantage of those opportunities to improve your own experience or skill set as a reviewer. Yeah. Yeah, and also maybe also learn from other more senior researchers, whether it's your advisor or instructors, because different people have different opinions and perspectives. And yeah, you can talk to different people to see what is their philosophy and their secret to be more efficient as a reviewer. Yeah.
So thank you guys. So I just want to thank all three of you again for taking the time out of your day to do this. I think this went great. I think that you had a lot of great insight. We had a lot of great questions from the chat. So thank you everyone for being here. We do have a short Google form that was posted in the chat for our viewers. So if you want to fill that out and provide some feedback. But yeah, just to finish it off, we'll just thank our panelists again. Thank you guys so much for being here and for offering all this wonderful information. And yeah, thanks everyone for being here. So that we'll go ahead and wrap up now.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Bye.